So, this video took a long time to make. Even as I record this now, I've only completed about 1/4 of the process.
Hi, this is me from close to a year later. That was about a month in. I was wrong.
Anyway, I began sketching out and labeling all of the details of the monster I've been making, called a Shield Moblin from The Legend of Zelda. I did this because I felt like I couldn't sculpt a thing unless I knew what I was sculpting. This was also, hopefully, to make it not uglier than it should be. Next, I needed to get all the materials I might need for this project, including all of the wonderful things you see before you. Then, I grabbed a nice medium gauge wire that I thought would be fit for the job of holding up this behemoth. Then, I just used my manly man strength to cut the wire.
Nice.
Then I needed to finish the wiring by adding the arms, which proved to be a big challenge. I ended up just wrapping a smaller wire around the big one to hold it in place, and then covering it with glue, which was, well, probably useless. Finally, I moved toward covering the whole thing with tinfoil. I do this because the Shield Moblin is a chunky boy, and that can use up a lot of clay. The tinfoil bulks up the figure to waste less clay, and gives the clay something to hold on to. Now, I decided to put a thin layer of clay on my sculpture, because I saw in a video if you put an initial layer of baked clay on a sculpture, it can make it easier to work with as you have a better surface. After the bake, I started bulking up his belly and pecs before moving on to the back to add some muscle and clay, before deciding that his back was too flat and also needed to be bulked up. Then I finished the night off by adding a belly button and a belt line. The next morning I went ahead and adjusted the arms because it didn't look like they were in the right position to hold a sword and shield. Then, I went ahead and changed a few key details on the front before adding a belt line on the back. The reason I added the belt line is because I wanted to know where to end the stomach and the back so the proportions don't get too out of place. Now I need to add a few more details, such as removing the belly button so I could beef up the stomach, and adding some thin wire to the arms. I did this because the big wire alone would be too smooth for the clay to hold on to. Eventually, the layers of the stomach just kept on getting bigger and bigger. Then while I was working on the back, to make some muscles I just had to smush some clay onto the surface and smooth it out and cut it to get a good enough result. After all that, I realized in order to make the legs, I would need to remove the baked clay, so I just lobbed the legs off. Then, to remake the legs, I wrapped a little wire on the big wire and cut it before adding on some clay and getting to work making the boots. Making the boots felt extra special to me, as that was when the sculpture actually started looking decent to me.
probably because it was the first piece of more intricate detail. Then I felt that it was about time to turn that belt line into a belt. Next, I made the top of the body flatter to accommodate a head, and then started adding muscle to the arms, which I did by way of smushing some clay into the arms and blending it into shape. After that was done, it was just a matter of adding the armband by wrapping some clay around the arm and using a sharp silicone tool to add texture. Then, after repeating that whole process again for the other arm, I went ahead and added a head, which I blended and smoothed into place, before adding some little eye sockets. Then, after adding some scroll cheeks, I realized I would need a few more pieces for this puzzle to be baked, because if they were soft, they would end up getting deformed. Those pieces include this creepy skull for the belt, some oval eyes for the eye sockets, some teeth to fit the mouth, a nose for the face, and this horn for the head. After I made those things, I went ahead and made sure I made a mouth. The next step were his wobbly ears, of which the first one had a piece ripped off for a reason that I totally know. Meanwhile, the second ear was fully intact and had a nice ring which I made by bending a thin piece of wire around a round tool. Also, I forgot to record me sticking his nose in his face. I did this first while we know the proportions of where to put everything else. The next step was sticking a small blob of clay in his mouth to act as the tongue, which I think worked out pretty well. Then, with the help of some tweezers, I was able to stick the crooked teeth right into his gums. At last, it was time to fill in those empty eye sockets with some eyes, which really brought this handsome fellow to life. After that, it was time to stick a horn on his head and a horned skull on his belt. Then I was on to making his signature armor plate around his neck. Or more accurately, I guess, around the bottom of his head. Now, if the sculpture was coming together before, this was a much bigger step. I'm really pleased with how it came out. All I really did for the next while is remove the baked clay around the legs and replace it with not baked clay, so they weren't quite so big and misshaped. Also, these things were supposed to be little leaves that went around the belt, but I messed it up, so just ignore them for now. I would say the leg cutting operation was quite a success. As you can see, the legs are much skinnier and less misshapen than before. But then I decided they were possibly a bit too skinny, so I bulked them up again, but to a point that makes sense. Now that I was happy with the legs for now, I decided that it was about time to work on the belt, so I stripped away the ugly earlier attempt at the leaves, or fabric, or whatever that is around the belt. Then I adjusted the belt to be more even and started adding something that just looked a good bit better. This next attempt at making the fabric, as I'm going to call it now, was just made from little strips of rolled out clay. Then we're on to the satisfying fabrication process. I needed to remove some of the lower back muscle to make room. Once I completed the top row of fabric, I decided to make the cloth between his legs and his second pair of cheeks so far, so I can make the bottom row. And I am happy with it. It turned out great, and I don't think I would have done it any other way. It looks especially good with the little skull on it. Now that I was finally done with that, I just needed to add the chest rings and the body would be finished. Apart from some smoothing and slight adjustments, of course. Now it was time for me to make the spear. I first tried to make it by cutting out a strip of XPF foam, before cutting it and sanding it into a spear shape. I soon realized this was impractical though, and tried something a little different. My next attempt, even though I didn't film too much of it, was much better. I got a nicely sized wire and surrounded it with clay before making a spear shape on top and exposing some wire to make it more game accurate. After I baked the spear, I did a few things such as sanding it down, adding wood texture, adding battle damage, adding a handle, and adding a little metallic bit before baking it again. Then I went ahead and removed the armbands because I had a new idea about how I would hand the Moblin spear and shield to him, as you will see in a bit. Now I didn't film me making the hand on the spear very much, but it's pretty simple. It's just all clay with a blob for the hand, noodles for fingers, and balls of clay for the knuckles. Then I made a small hole on the bottom of the hand to fit the wire on the arm so I could better connect the two. After I baked all that, I went ahead and tested to see if my plan worked. And it did! It stuck on perfectly and I was very happy with it. Next up, I needed to make the shield, and since making that out of clay would weigh about as much as the Titanic, I opted to make it out of XPF foam instead. This was my first attempt, which I decided to come back to after failing 2 more times in different attempts and deciding that it was actually not that bad and really quite salvageable. Anyway, after some surgery and gluing, I had got to my shield to shape. But the glue I used melted the foam, and I didn't have any hole filler, so I just used some white clay to patch it up. Which was not the best option, as it's impermanent because you can't bake foam. But after waiting 3 weeks for the foam to arrive, I wasn't going to order something else. Then I was on to adding some wild, game-accurate battle damage with a knife. And then some possibly accurate wood texture with a pencil, as well as roughing it up a bit with one of my tools for that added effect. Then I nearly forgot to make the rivets of the shield, so I started by chopping up some cubes. After I chopped up enough of them, I decided they were already small enough to just sand them into shape. Once I had a nice array of rivets, I went ahead and started gluing them on. Now I did use the same glue that melted my foam earlier, but it didn't seem to affect it as much here. That's probably because I didn't need to use as much. Now since the shield was effectively done, it was time to paint. I started by using a special extra liquidy glue called Mod Podge, which can be used for a lot of things. One of its uses is for painting foam, as usually the foam will soak up most of the paint, but with Mod Podge it becomes a hardened surface. If you then mix Mod Podge with paint, you can also use it as a primer, which is an initial layer of paint. But you have to make sure to use a foam brush, as bristles will be ruined by Mod Podge. After the front side had dried, I got to work on the back. Now you may notice that the wet paint is lighter than the dry stuff. That's because the white Mod Podge makes the dark paint lighter. But Mod Podge dries clear, so only the darker color remains. So for my first try at making the shield color, I made a very yellow color because the shield looked like that in the main picture I was using as a reference. But I ended up hating it. So my first plan was to make a better color mix of brown and white, then dilute that into a wash so it wouldn't completely drown out the yellow and it would still be shiny. I made the wash by adding some soap and a bit of water to the paint before mixing it all up. Once it was done, I mixed it all up and hoped it was good. Now the wash did make it look less yellow, but it still didn't look good, so I wasn't quite done with it yet. For now though, I decided to focus on making the handle for the shield, which I made by twisting a thick enough wire into shape. before sanding it down so clay and paint would more easily stick to it. Then I used some clay to make the bottom rounded and some thin flattened clay to make the handle straps. After that was baked, I decided to start making the hand holding it, with the blob for the palm, the noodles for the fingers, and the balls for the knuckles. Then after some quick detailing and a hole in the bottom, it was ready to bake. Then, after a quick fit test, I needed to make the metal rim thing that the handle would attach to on the back. I made this by slicing out some foam from an earlier Shield attempt before sanding it down into shape. Once it was ready, I went over it with the same Mod Podge mix as before, not bothering to paint the bottom as it wouldn't be visible. Now it was time to use an actually good product at gluing foam, white Gorilla Glue. With this stuff, you just get the surface damp, and then with just a little glue, it expands and glues well. Then I just stuck it right into place. Now the shield was pretty dark, and not quite what I had in mind, so I got to work, mixing up the perfect color. Then, once I got a color that looked like this wood here, I was happy. Then I got my flattish brush and started painting. I originally meant this to be more of a dry brush when I made the color, but a dry brush is supposed to be a highlight, and I just painted the whole shield with this because I liked it so much. Then once that was done, I knew it was time to paint the rivets. So I started by painting them all this dark gray color. After that, it was time to add some shading as I made the lighter gray color. With that, I painted the metal rim on the back as well as the tops of the rivets. Next, I just used some white paint for the tops of the rivets and wiped most of it away to give it a nice effect. Now admittedly the back was a little worse, but at least it'll mainly be out of view. Then after some cleanup work and making the shield even lighter, I decided I was finished and wanted to glue the hand in. I ended up using way too much glue, but I was able to clean up the foamy residue after and hide it with some more paint. Finally, I was able to put its shield in its proper spot. After that, it was just a matter of replacing the lost armband. But just when I was about to bake, I had realized I forgot something. To make the little hairs on the back of his head, I started by chopping up some little clay bits. Then I just went ahead and baked them because they were small enough to sand into shape as is. Once they were good enough, I just stuck them right into his head. Then I realized I forgot something else, a more minor detail. So, as a final fix before I was ready to bake, I used a sharp knife to cut a crack into the skull in his belt. Once the sculpture was done baking and thankfully unbroken, I started looking for cracks that had formed. I only found one under the armpit, so I just filled in with some unbaked clay and got ready to paint. The first step in my painting process was just covering everything in a basic white paint as a primer. And I know it was already white, but I wanted to make it all really the exact same, and I thought this first layer would help. Now here came my first of many mistakes. I had assumed that the beast was in fact more red than anything else. This is probably because I had played Zelda games that had red monsters more recently. Anyway, this slightly off red got painted on everywhere that there was flesh. Also assume any layer I've added to the flesh, I've also added to the hands. Here I decided that my primary method of painting would be sponging, because it's quick and it lays on paint well. This layer was just the previous layer, but plus a little more red paint. I forgot to film the beginning of this layer, but around this time I realized that the beast was actually supposed to be pretty pink, so I knew I wanted a darker purple in all of the deeper crevices for shading, which is best put at the beginning so the lighter layers can go on top. This next layer functioned as a replacement to the last one. It was a better mix of the same colors for the same thing. This is also what I meant when I said the first of many mistakes earlier. I just kept messing up the colors, but I did like this one. Besides sponging, I also went back in with a brush to make sure it covered everything. My next layer was meant to be a highlight over everything that wasn't a crevice, but it ended up not being a big enough change to be really what I wanted. This was another failed color, but I did realize that this more pinkish color was closer to what I wanted. Again, I tried mixing up a better color, and this time I ended up with a really nice shade of reddish pinkish purple that I decided would stay as my main color. Then I added a little white to the same color and went over everything one more time. Now that I have my shading and main color, all I needed was the highlights. For this I mixed up a very pale pink and applied it everywhere on my reference highlights. I decided to dry brush this color, but that combined with how pale it was just made it look like the Moblin was covered in dust. Fortunately, I was able to just add some pink to the old color and make it less pale. Then I painted it on the same spots and all was well. This is where I ended with the monster's flesh. After all that, I went on to paint his golden accessories with the deep gold. This time I didn't mix up any colors or use different layers. This shiny gold was good enough as it was. Once the gold was looking nice, I moved on to painting the belt with a simple black. Next, I really went ahead of myself by painting the horn and the inside of the skull black off camera. But at least I did manage to film the finishing touches. And somehow I managed to do the same thing with the mouth. Next, I wanted to give the roots of his hair some light gray color. Then I was on to making a simple gray wash to give his armbands and skull some shading and a dirtier look. Now I was on to coloring in those eyes and the tongue with a nice light blue. To finish the eyes and mouth, I used a little sponge tip to make the pupils and painted the teeth white. Later, I also cleaned up the pupils to make them look a little nicer. Next, I got to work on painting the belt fabric with a light brown. I also made sure to paint the tops and bottoms without making a mess. After all that, I painted the boots with the same brown color. I then decided that the color was too dark and I made it lighter. Then I applied that color to the shoes and the tops of the fabric, making sure to leave some darker roots. The final step for the Moblin's pants was painting the gold metal piece on the back, which as I understand doesn't do much to help him. Then I noticed that the horns of the skull were supposed to be a different color, so I mixed up a new less pale color and painted it on. Next, it was finally time to paint the spear. I started by painting the wood with a light brown, which I decided was too light, so I made it a bit darker, which I then decided was too dark. I then realized that any one solid color wouldn't work for how I wanted this to look. I forgot to show this on camera, but what I ended up doing was using a lighter brown as a base, and then using a darker brown wash. It was kind of like I was staining the lighter colored wood. Fast forward to the wood already being done, and we're on to painting the spear head and metal bit. And while we're at it, the shield handle as well. I start by mixing up a simple dark gray and using it as a base layer for each part. The next step was painting the edges of the spearhead and metal bit with a slightly lighter gray. Then after that, with a much lighter gray, dry brushed on. Now it was time for the last step of the spear, the handle. I started by painting in the little indents at the end of the handle with a simple gray. Then I decided that I wanted more indents along the handle, so I made some with a powered chisel. Then after the indents were made, I just had to paint them in. And with that, the spear and shield were done. But there was still one last thing to paint, the bottom of his pants. For this, I started with a bright but pale yellow all over. After that, I painted on a brown stripe pattern, which actually functions as kind of a reality check, because this beast may look dumb, but it clearly slayed a tiger. And that was really the end of the painting. After some cleanup work, of course. Though you may notice that the horn is a little longer. That's because I accidentally bumped his head and took off the tip. So I replaced it and made it a bit more pronounced as well. Now that the Moblin was complete, I needed a base for him to stand on, because the wooden block wasn't quite what I had in mind. So I started measuring out exactly how big I wanted this base to be. Then I took those measurements and used them to cut out a nice square piece of foam. But I had a feeling it may not offer quite enough support. So I went to straighten up and cut down the thinnest wood board I had on hand to the same size as the foam. Then, using those boards, I cut and sanded the foam block until it nicely fit in between them. Now it was time to put this sandwich together using some white Gorilla Glue, which works with both wood and foam. But I did forget the instruction of clamping the parts as the glue dries, which left this big gap. Thankfully though, this didn't end up mattering. And I at least got the second board right. This next part probably wasn't necessary, but I decided to use some black Mod Podge to coat everything in an even surface and strengthen the foam. Now at this point, the base is pretty solid, but its sides are uneven because I cut the foam a little too much. But I have a solution, in the form of hole filler. I use this by mixing up the solid form until it's a nice paste. Then I just apply that over the surface of my choice and it solidifies in 30 minutes. Magic. And I know what you may be thinking. My choice to paint it with black and to use a white hole filler in the middle did make my base look like a square Oreo, and I accept full responsibility for that. For this next part, I will need some dirt. But I refuse to touch grass. Anyways, I needed this dirt to make some dirt. The recipe I actually used was a bunch of hole filler, some Mod Podge, some brown paint, and some dirt, all mixed together. But I ran out of brown paint, so I tried adding some black to darken the color, and then some white to lighten it up. But then somehow I just added some orange and I got the perfect color. Then I just had to spread the dirt mixture all over my base to get a nice dirt platform, which, because of the hole filler, will dry solid in 30 minutes. And I was super happy with the result. It was just what I wanted. My plan for this dirt base was to have the Moblin standing in the middle, guarding a path. So I marked down the space in between his legs for the width of the path, and made a quick guide out of paper to run down the middle. Then I realized that I wanted the top of the base to be a bit more flat and even. So I started by making some more hole filler dirt and tried to fill in some of the deeper parts. Once that was done, I wanted to sand it down to get rid of anything sticking up and make it extra flat. But then I decided that I also wanted the path to be relatively flat, so I cut into the dirt to remember the outline and sanded that too. Once the whole top was nice and even, I thought it might be about time to add some life growing out of this dirt. To do this, I painted some Mod Podge onto one side of the path using a stiff brush. Then I covered that in a healthy layer of green flock to act as the grass. After that, I sprayed it with some isopropyl alcohol to reduce the surface tension. That way, when I now spray it with some watered down Mod Podge, it will seep into the grass and lock everything in place. Then, for the other side, I just had to repeat that same process. Now that the grass was done, I wanted to make the path look more properly worn down. So I got some tools together and started hammering, chipping, and imprinting at it. The next step was making the path the right color, which, in game, is a much lighter, sort of sun-bleached stroke color. So to make this, I just mixed together some brown and white paint. Once that was done, I just had to paint it on. But it ended up being way too light. So instead, I just used a light Caucasian color I had to go over the whole thing with. Now it was looking a bit better, but I still wanted it to look less clean, so I made a brown wash to help dirty it up. Lastly, for this space, I wanted to paint the bottom brown as well, just because I didn't want to leave anything feeling unfinished. Finally, it was time for the moment of truth, attaching the Moblin to the base. To do this, I started by removing the Moblin from the wood block this sculpture had begun with. Then I used a drill to make holes in the base where the wire sticking out of his feet would go, making sure they were just the right size. Lastly, I slotted the Moblin into place, and thankfully the whole thing stayed together. But I also noticed that the back of his feet were off the ground, which was probably because the wood block was uneven. To fix this, I just filled in the gaps with some hole filler. Fortunately, I still had the original paint I used for the shoes, so to fix the color I could just repaint it. After that, I just used a metal pick to scrape away the excess of the paint and hole filler. Then I found a new problem. The base rocked onto one corner, so I used a piece of hardened clay to act as a shim. Next, I glued it on and painted it brown to blend in. Finally, it was time to attach the hands to the Moblin. I did this by just sliding them onto the exposed wire and using some glue. And this is where I originally intended to end with the sculpture. But I had a last-minute idea that I thought was too good to ignore, which was to hide this little relic somewhere on my sculpture. To do that, I started by making the 3D 9 shape the amber relic has. Once it was ready to go into the oven, I gave it a brush with some isopropyl alcohol to remove any tool marks. Then it was time to paint. And, I don't know how to do that. But I have heard of a cool technique that can. So I started practicing wet blending, which is where you put two wet colors together and blend the area in between. So I put more orange where the orange was and more yellow where the yellow was. Then I just blended the sides together. Next, I wanted to try and make the relic extra shiny and durable by coating it in UV resin. This process includes pouring it on, spreading it around, and shining some UV light to cure it. But it would seem some resin did go through the hole and partially cure on the back, which left a less nice coat. Thankfully, I was able to remove it with my metal pick without taking off the paint. Once that was done, I gave the backside a proper coat. Now I needed a place to hide this relic, and I decided this would come in the form of a rock that could be taken out of its place and put back. To make the rock, I cut out a few foam chunks to be glued together. Then, once I had a big enough piece, I cut away at it until it resembled a nice rock, making sure not to cut too much so there would still be room for the hiding spot. Now that it looks like a decent rock, it was time to add the hiding spot, which will just be a hole that's big enough for the relic to fit in with a little room. Lastly, to help the rock stick in the ground, I made some pebbles and glued those to the underside. And with that being done, it's finally time to add some color. Like the shield again, I mixed the first dark gray color with some Mod Podge so the foam wouldn't absorb the paint, and because it gives the foam some more strength. Next, I wanted to add some highlights with a lighter gray and much lighter gray. I highlighted these by wiping away most of the paint and only using a little to hit the edges. Now, there was one last thing I wanted to do before adding everything to the base. I wanted to make some little rocks for extra decoration. To do that, I started by chopping up some bits of foam. Then, to make the bits more beat up and rocky, I put them in a cup of rocks and gave it a good shake. Afterwards, they came out looking maybe better, and I picked my favorite from the bunch. Then it was time for some really fun painting. This is because to paint these bits, I just slammed them repeatedly with a sponge coated in gray Mod Podge. When the Mod Podge dried, they did end up being a bit too dark, so I went over them again with a light gray. Now all the bits were ready to be added to the base. So I started digging a trench for the pebbles attached to the bottom of the rock to go into. And to keep the rock in place while also allowing it to be removed and put back, I filled the trench with a bit of brown clay. Then I just stuck both the relic and the rock into place. And the very last thing I did for this sculpture was add some of those little rocks around for decoration. And with that being done, I'm excited to start the ending showcase.
I want to give a few final notes. Firstly is why this took so long. The main reason being that I don't have a lot of experience. For example, this is the first time I've made a video, made a base, used techniques like dry brushing and wet blending, or used materials like foam or hole filler. So I took my time to figure it out. It could also be that I'm busy and work too slow. Either way, I hope I'm a little faster next time. Next, I want to give a few quick thanks. Firstly, to family and friends for putting up with how long I took, to a real helpful server, to some Canadian guy who I copied any skills I have from, and finally to Prod Jack, who made all the music for this video. So please, any people looking for some music to use, or any big game companies who pay exclusively with large money bags, feel free to reach out to them. Well, I guess it is time to start looking for what to do next.